This video is going to be about cravings, addictions, etc., and it'll be related to the mouth, throat, liver. Cravings and addiction are a super interesting topic through the lens of psychobiology because they can seem so self destructive, but really they're kind of runaway adaptive survival programs like everything else trauma based. And using that lens of understanding to reintegrate and heal them can bring an enormous amount of change, and it can happen quite rapidly. They say in self help circles that once you're an addict, you're always an addict, and those blueprints are always there. There's very easy to fall back into those behavioral patterns, but really, addictions are based on a constellation of trauma constructs which kind of link together and become circular and self parasitic. And if you reintegrate key trauma constructs in that loop, you can really break the back of the addiction, and you can do that overnight. So we'll start with an easy example, food addictions. And I'll use a case study of a client that came to a workshop, and it was a long, like 24-hour workshop, and she only had one topic she wanted to deal with, and that's snacking addiction. She was just obsessed with food, overeating. She couldn't stop. No matter how healthy her lifestyle is, there was always this drive to constantly overeat. And we really dug into it over the course of many hours, and we found one core trauma construct, which was the cornerstone of all her addiction blueprints in terms of eating, and reintegrated it. And after that, her life fully changed. She was able to stop her kind of disordered eating behaviors. She could have junk food around without impulsively eating it. And it was really a overnight change. So when we found her core blueprint, it was actually very counterintuitive. It was a memory of her being a kid and her parents. They were saying, you need to finish all the food on your plate. And she was really way past full, and she had a mouthful of brown rice, and she didn't want to swallow. And it started a trauma construct of not wanting to swallow, which is a trauma in the throat. And it was related to the sensory track of just feeling so full and feeling stuffed and having your mouth full of food. And counterintuitively, this is actually what created a food addiction, because if you have this trauma of not wanting to swallow, not being allowed to swallow, not being able to swallow, it changes your consciousness and changes your body with a trauma construct that makes you want to swallow more. And that's kind of what a food craving can be. It can be just you restaging the trauma of not being able to swallow. Another blueprint of addiction, this one is for kind of cannabis addiction. There was a case where somebody had kind of like a big jar of cannabis, and inside of it was some flavored rolling papers that kind of smelled like cherry, really candy smelling. And he wasn't able to smoke the cannabis because he was being drug tested, but he would take it out and he would kind of open the jar and smell it and smell the kind of cherry flavor from the rolling papers, and he would salivate over it and just like think how unfair it was that he was getting drug tested and couldn't smoke this really nice smelling cannabis. And the cannabis was kind of conceptualized into something you swallow because of the cherry flavor. By adding that sensory stimulus of cherry, the cannabis kind of took on the characteristic of a food in a way in terms of consciousness, and developed this trauma construct of not being allowed to swallow, which sat kind of deep in the throat with the sensory track of the smell of cannabis. And this is what creates generally what we call cannabis cravings. So he sat there, and quite often he would just get this feeling in his mouth like, oh, I just really need to consume cannabis. And this was a core blueprint, a core construct, the backbone of the addiction. So with food addictions, smoking addictions, addictions related to putting things in the mouth, very often it's involved with traumas of not being able to swallow, not being allowed to swallow, and most often it's related back to breastfeeding. The most powerful blueprints come from childhood, and if you have an oral fixation, or if you generally smoke or crave something in your mouth, it's very possible at some point your breastfeeding was disrupted early, or you and your mom had a traumatic experience during breastfeeding, and she wasn't producing milk, etc. So these are really important things to kind of look into. So yeah, if you want to look for the blueprint of addictions, very often you can look for the core constructs. So let's say you were trying to disentangle a cigar addiction. You would look for times when somebody had a half-smoked cigar, let's say, in their pocket, and they're walking around all day, and their wife was saying, no, you can't smoke that, you can't smoke that. But at the same time, you were smelling it, you're getting the sensory stimulus, and you're thinking about how unfair it is that you're not allowed to smoke this cigar. This is what creates kind of a core blueprint of addiction. And in general, with smoking addiction, there's a unique thing that happens related to fear and smoke. Because fear trauma sits in the lungs, if you have a trauma where there's smoke involved and there's fear involved, or even just smoke, if you have one of these traumas, you'll subconsciously link the trauma of fear with your lungs and with smoke, and actually that'll contribute to addictions involving smoking, because you'll naturally be trying to restage your smoke-based trauma by lighting up a cigarette. So this is something really important to look at for any type of smokers, is to look at traumatic experiences when they're younger, when there was smoke involved, or fear, or both. 9 out of 10 lung cancer patients were smokers. That's the common statistic. And it's kind of mind-blowing because there's so many smokers that don't get lung cancer. And yet 10% of people who never smoked get lung cancer. And it seems to be the case that actually one of the main drivers of lung cancer is fear-based trauma in the lungs. And smokers just tend to be magnetized to smoking and acidifying their lungs, because in a way they're trying to stimulate that area in an attempt to heal. Another interesting kind of blueprint of lung trauma and addiction is birth trauma. When you're born from a fluid environment, and you're born into this world full of air, and actually your first breath you take is horribly traumatizing to the lungs, because it's the first time gas hit your lungs, and it stings and burns, and it's quite often why babies are screaming so badly after birth. It's this trauma in the lungs. So these things are difficult to regress back into and access. It is possible, using advanced techniques like iboga and trauma plastinogens, you can heal a blueprint like that. Not super common in the kind of standard practice for the average person, though. Another thing related to food cravings in particular is starvation trauma. If you're ever in a situation where you are really hungry and you develop a trauma construct thinking you're starving, perceive starvation, and then you finally eat, let's say, a hot dog, and that's how you break your starvation, you'll find that every time you're in a situation where you're starving, you crave a hot dog. It's kind of a restaging thing, an adaptive thing. It's a way for you to avoid starvation. So that's something worth looking at if you tune into kind of your hunger and tune into a time when you're out on the town and there's not food around. You have this perception of starvation, and you crave something. That thing is the sensory track of a starvation trauma in your liver, and it should be reintegrated. Your liver is critical. It's one of the kind of 5 critical organs bioenergetically, and it holds a lot of toxicity when it's in starvation mode because it's not able to detox. And the liver can actually flip back and forth between starvation mode and detox mode. Psychobiologically, this is a switch you can actually flip if you know what you're doing. So anytime there's food cravings related or directly linked to starvation, look for liver traumas. And it's possible that, let's say you were really starving and you went over to your friend's house and he gave you a slice of pizza, but you guys also smoked a bunch of cigarettes. It's possible that the cigarette signature can link to the starvation trauma and act as one of these sensory tracks. So it is possible that this can happen not just for food, but other types of perceived nourishment like smoking. So that's also something to consider if you're one of these people who, when they're really starving, they just crave a cigarette and not food. You might go back and look through memories where you're really, really hungry and you got some food finally and you had a cigarette, something like that. This is kind of an interesting setup. So, sexual cravings are really interesting. These are based on trauma constructs that are created where the sensory tract of the trauma was filled with the kind of energetic signature of sexual arousal. So, if you ever have a trauma where you're in a high state of sexual arousal, that sexual arousal be written into the sensory tract, and anytime you're sexually aroused, this trauma construct restages. But also, anytime you restage the sensory components of the trauma, you'll feel the sexual arousal again. So, this is where kind of kinks come from. I'll give you an example that happened to me personally. I had a quite hot blooded girlfriend, and then one day we were in bed in a sexual context, and she started an argument, got quite upset at me, and I was laying face down on the bed, and she sat on my lower back and just was like kind of berating me and yelling at me and humiliating me. And I was kind of in a state of sexual arousal when it happened. And I noticed afterward, I kind of always had this feeling like in the back of my mind, like, you know what? Like, I might really like a girlfriend that was quite bossy, that was quite like bossy in terms of her sexuality. And it just kind of came out of nowhere. And finding this trauma later and reintegrating it, that kind of thought disappeared. And it turns out I was naturally associating kind of a mean, bossy woman with my trauma construct of my, I believe it's called the ischial bone on the lower back. This is the bone related to humiliating treatment from behind. You know, when people are laughing behind your back or spanking triggers this place. Developing a trauma here with the sensory tract of sexual arousal, I naturally kind of gravitated toward that, restaging that same situation and caused one of these kind of sexual hang-ups. So, if you're ever dealing with somebody who'd like to address their sexuality and maybe who has strange kinks, a strange sex life, it's really important to look at traumas that happen during sex or in a state of high sexual arousal. So, going back to substance addiction, an addiction really takes a life of its own, trauma by trauma. Um, and this is what we call tolerance. You know, if you're an opioid user, you'll take one tablet the first week, and then a few weeks later, you'll find it takes two tablets to feel the same, and three tablets. And this is how an addiction turns into kind of financial ruin and really gets a life of its own through this kind of tolerance effect. And this tolerance effect seems to be psychobiological in nature. For example, it's well known that with opioid addicts, if they change their environment and use the same amount of drugs, it's possible for them to overdose. And nobody ever quite understood why, but it's very clearly seen. And it's because if you have 10 traumas in your home of doing drugs, and then you go to your friend's house and you're not restaging those traumas with the sensory component of drugs, you don't have the sensory stimulus of the drug signature in your perceptual field at your friend's house. So if you do the drugs, they essentially hit you harder because they're not fighting through the kind of sensory blockade of all the traumas containing the same drug signature. So overdose would be something to look at. If you're dealing with helping an addict through their addictions, you would try to reintegrate every trauma they had where they overdosed or had a particularly difficult trauma while they were on drugs, and this will essentially psychobiologically lower the tolerance. This is pretty well validated. Iboga, which I talk about quite often, is used at high doses for reversing opioid addiction, and nobody knows quite how it works. A lot of scientists, they are studying it for neuropharmacological purposes, and nobody can quite explain how you can be a full heroin addict in the morning, take a large dose of Iboga, by the next morning have no withdrawal symptoms, have no tolerance, and it actually works so well. It's dangerous because it eliminates tolerance so quickly. People tend to overdose by taking the normal dose of drugs that they're used to. So it seems to work because Iboga is a trauma plastinogen. It helps reintegrate active traumas. So if you're an opioid user with quite a lot of active traumas with the signature of opioids inside the sensory tract, and you take Iboga and those spontaneously reintegrate, then you can lose your tolerance. And if the traumas spontaneously reintegrate that have the core blueprints of addiction, then you can spontaneously bounce back from addiction. And it's quite permanent. Some of the clinics in Mexico that do this, they boast a 50 to 60% success rate in treating opioid addiction over the 6-month period, whereas things like opioid replacement therapy and group therapy, AA, things like that, they have about a 5 to 6% success rate over the 5 to 6 month period. So it's clear that trauma plastinogens like Iboga are doing something unique and exceptional, and to me it's clear that they're acting psychobiologically by removing the sensory tract of traumas that contain the drug signature. So another thing to look at for the development of addiction is related to drugs which have a withdrawal symptom, where you run out of the drug and your body starts feeling really bad and you get really sick. It's important to look for thyroid traumas related to the drug. If you have a thyroid trauma with a sensory component of withdrawal in it, you'll always associate kind of withdrawal and the feeling of running out of time or being too slow. So with any drug addict that has an addiction to opioids or other drugs with kind of this characteristic, it's really important to go back and find the first memories they have of running out of time to buy more drugs, or being in withdrawal and running out of time for some reason. This is kind of a key blueprint to roll back addiction. The last topic is about personality structures. These kind of addictions form in a quite complex manner. Very often, the setup is there's some kind of trauma at a very young age about not being able to swallow mother's milk, not being nourished. And the body, the consciousness has to adapt to that. So it creates a trauma construct in the throat, but it also creates a mental field structure, personality structure that says, basically, I'm not being nourished. I'm going to seek external nourishment. And over time, this personality structure, it evolves, kind of other traumas linked to it, other personality structures linked to it. And then around adult age, this person might try a cigarette. And the cigarette, the energetic nourishment they perceive from the cigarette smoke going in their mouth and them feeling what they perceive as good, this signature of action matches perfectly to the nourishment which they're kind of missing energetically. And so this concept of smoking a cigarette or smoking cannabis or doing a drug, having a drink, it links into the old personality structure of I'm not being nourished, I'll seek external nourishment. And we talked about it in the advanced psychobiology. When you have a lot of trauma with an archetype, the archetype can self-assemble into a bit of a landing pad, and then the sensory component of the trauma can get compressed and injected into that landing pad with a life of its own to form what we call an entity. So what can happen is you have this trauma construct of not being nourished, you develop a personality structure, it has a landing pad, and what lands in that landing pad is essentially the DNA of the plant. The plant's energetic field, the plant spirit, as some people call it. It links to that personality structure, and the plant spirit actually provides energetic nourishment in exchange for some kind of attention and biophotonic exchange, and that's somewhat healthy, somewhat healthy coping mechanism. But what can happen after that is this kind of thing evolves and the personality structures evolve, more trauma is created, more personality structures linked to this core concept, and actually the plant spirit, the plant DNA is no longer the perfect match for that landing pad, and in fact the perfect match for that landing pad is an external entity from somebody else or from the collective field, which is an addiction entity, and that can take the place and launch this personality structure from kind of a healthy coping mechanism to just a kind of rip-roaring addiction. So you see this often in people who start smoking cannabis. They start smoking cannabis with their friends. It's really lighthearted, really fun, pretty innocent. And then it's like a switch flips and they have a darkness come over that behavioral pattern and they start doing hard drugs and they spiral into extreme addiction. What they've done is they've created a higher dimensional structure through their use of cannabis or cigarettes or whatever, and they've really empowered it, and other traumas have linked to it, and then eventually it kind of takes a life of its own. So this is something to look at, and these things can be kind of addressed. You can remove personality structures, and the general idea is to break as many core constructs of the addiction blueprints as you can. There's many of them working together in a circle. If you make enough breaks in that circle, then everything else will dissolve, and you don't have to find every single trauma. You should just find the kind of deepest, most archetypal traumas, which are related to nourishment and sustaining. Another key blueprint, which is different than all the others, is a trauma construct with a sensory tract containing anticipation of a variable reward. So a variable reward schedule is basically something that was presented by an author, an expert in gamification and the structure of addiction and how to make products more addictive, particularly software products. He stated that the kind of core concept to make something addictive is it needs to have a variable reward schedule. So for example, if you open your refrigerator and there's a glass of milk, close it, open it again, it's just a glass of milk, you're not going to want to open and close the fridge a lot. But if you open the fridge and there's a glass of milk, next time you open it, there's a sandwich, next time there's a cake, you're going to sit there all day long opening that fridge. It'll become addictive, and it's this variable reward schedule. So the hook model is hook, action, investment, variable reward. This is kind of the cycle of an addictive product. And this might be most relevant for somebody like a gambling addict, because for them there's not the sensory component of the substances. It's just this anticipation of a variable reward. So their blueprint might be much easier to find, and once you find that variable reward blueprint, that might in itself take care of the entire addiction. So some situations where anticipation of a variable reward could get written into trauma constructs. Let's say that you have a grandfather and every week you go to his house after school and you tell him how you did at school, and then sometimes he is so proud of you, he takes $5 out of his pocket, hands it to you, and then gives you a sip of his beer as a treat. And, each week you go to his house, you look forward to the money. Sometimes he doesn't get excited. Sometimes he does. When you do get rewarded, you get a sip of beer. This is how you create a blueprint of alcoholism, and by introducing a variable reward linked. This is also something to look at with alcoholics and drug users. Let's say every time you go to a bartender, they make you a drink, and one time out of 10, they add a lot of more liquor to it and some flavoring, and you feel like you got a variable reward. This is something to look at. With drug users, just due to the nature of the drug supply, variable reward ends up getting baked into drug seeking based traumas. So if you go and buy drugs and 5 times out of 10, it's average, and then occasionally the drugs are really, really strong or really, really cheap, or there's some kind of variable reward, and then you have a trauma construct that captures this anticipation of variable reward. This is how you end up kind of stuck in a game construct of addiction. So, most particularly gambling addictions, but also addictions where you're kind of having to go through the routine of feeding your habit, this kind of pressing the button over and over and over again, even though you know it's hurting you, usually has some type of variable reward based trauma. One example that happened to me is that I used to smoke cigarettes and was quite addicted to them. And when I kind of disassembled all my addictive blueprints, as many as I could find, I found that I had a variable reward schedule linked to smoking. So that's why, even though I know it was bad for me and I didn't like the taste, I would keep opening a pack of cigarettes and keep opening a pack of cigarettes, keep pulling a cigarette out. I found a variable reward construct, and it actually came from when I was younger and I wasn't old enough to buy cigarettes. Occasionally, me and my friends would go to the gas station near my house and play Hey Mister. We would just ask somebody if they would buy us cigarettes, and this was like really risky because we were quite young, and we would often get turned down. And occasionally, we would have somebody help us out. And one time, somebody bought us cigarettes, but as he was walking into the store, somebody screamed at him that knew him from down the street, from the neighborhood, and it shocked us so bad because we thought we were caught or in trouble. So I had a trauma construct right at the moment that I had gotten a variable reward related to cigarettes, right when somebody was like, sure, I'll help you out, and we were going to get our cigarettes. So it's a variable reward schedule, but it also must be written into a trauma construct, so there's a trauma involved. So this is the kind of number one thing to think about to break the backbone of gamification behavior in addiction, to find a situation when there was anticipation of a variable reward written into a trauma construct.